In the last episode of this series, we saw that Tim Flock would take the 1952 championship either way, and today in this episode, we will take a look at the 1953 season with a consistent points format. In 1953, there would only be 6 full-time drivers: Dick Rathmann, 2-time champion Lee Petty, 1951 champion Fonty Flock, Herb Thomas, Buck Baker, and defending champion Tim Flock. In the opening 6 races, we would only have 2 full-time winners. Lee Petty would win the season opener at West Palm Beach, and then again in race 6 at Richmond. Herb Thomas would win race 3 at Spring Lake and would go back-to-back by winning at North Wilkesboro. So after 6 races, we would already have the 3 heavy hitters of Herb Thomas, Dick Rathmann, and Lee Petty. At race 7 in Macon, Dick Rathmann would win the race while Herb Thomas would finish second, and the gap was now 18 points. Lee Petty would finish 19th and would now be 150 points back. At Langhorne, Thomas would finish 7th while Rathmann would finish 16th, growing the gap to 54 points. And Petty would finish second, shrinking his gap to 126 points. At Columbia, Thomas would finish 8th while Rathmann would finish 16th, once again growing the gap to 81 points. Lee Petty would finish 5th and was now 113 points back. At Hickory, Thomas would finish a disappointing 20th while Rathmann would finish 5th and shrink the gap to 29 points. Lee Petty would finish 15th and was now 98 points back. At Martinsville, Thomas would finish 2nd while Rathmann would finish 3rd. It was now 44 points back. And Lee Petty's gap, despite winning the race, would flatline to 98 points. At Columbus, Herb Thomas would win the race, and after 12 races, he would have the point lead over Dick Rathmann and Lee Petty. At race 13 in Raleigh, Thomas would finish 4th while Rathmann would finish 6th, and Rathmann was now behind by 64 points. Lee Petty would finish 8th and was now 154 points back. At Shreveport, Rathmann, despite finishing ahead of Thomas, he would lose points and was now 69 points back. Petty would win the race and would only cut the gap to 149 points. At Pensacola, Thomas would win the race while Rathmann finished 2nd and was now 74 points back. Petty would finish 3rd and was now 159 points behind. At Langhorne, Dick Rathmann would win while Thomas would finish 4th and would shrink the gap to 49 points. Petty finished 2nd and the gap was now back to 149 points. At High Point, Herb Thomas would win while Rathmann finished 2nd and was now 64 points behind. Lee Petty would finish 5th and was now 179 points back. At Wilson, Rathmann would finish 2nd and Thomas 3rd, and halfway through the season, it seemed like it was going to be a showdown between the Hudson Hornet of Herb Thomas and Dick Rathmann. At Rochester, Thomas would win the race while Rathmann finished 2nd and grew the gap to 74 points. At Spartanburg, Thomas would finish 3rd while Rathmann finished 10th, and the gap was now 105 points. At Morristown, Dick Rathmann would win the race while Thomas would finish 2nd and was now 95 points back. At Atlanta, Thomas would win while Rathmann finished 2nd, growing the gap to 105 points. At Rapid City, Thomas would win again and Rathmann finished 2nd, extending the gap to 115 points. At North Platte, the gap would end up staying the same, and with 13 races to go, Herb Thomas seemed to have control over the championship. And Dick Rathmann, if he wanted to win the championship, he would have quite the uphill battle. At Davenport, Thomas would win while Rathmann finished 4th and grow the gap to 140 points. At Hillsboro, Thomas would finish 2nd and Rathmann would have an abysmal 19th place finish that was now a whopping 204 points behind. At Weaverville, Rathmann would gouge more points by finishing 14th while Thomas finished 2nd, and the gap was now 250 points. At Virginia Beach, Thomas would win the race while Rathmann would finish 4th and was now 275 points behind. At Hickory, Thomas would finish 2nd and Rathmann 12th, and the gap was now 318 points. At the Southern 500, Thomas would have a solid 5th place finish, while Dick Rathmann would have an abysmal day and knock himself out of the championship picture with a 42nd place finish. And with 7 races to go, all Herb Thomas had to do was finish 11th or better in the remaining 7 races, and he would be crowned as the champion. At Macon, Petty finished 2nd while Thomas finished 6th and was now 350 points back. All Thomas had to do now was finish 12th. At Langhorne, Thomas finished 2nd and Petty 6th. The gap was now 380 points, and now the threshold moved to 20th. At Bloomsburg, Thomas would win the race while Petty would finish 6th, and the gap was now 405 points. But in the last 4 races of the season, due to the field sizes not exceeding 31 cars, the max amount of points Thomas would lose was 380 points, 25 points less than what the gap from him to Petty was. And with 4 races to go, Herb Thomas would lock up the championship. So either way, Herb Thomas would claim the championship in 1953, but in this timeline, it would only be his first due to his 51 title going to Fonty Flock. Herb Thomas's 1953 season was so consistent that his 2 biggest competitors just couldn't keep up, and it resulted in Herb Thomas winning the championship 4 races before the end of the season. Well, that'll do it for today, guys. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next week for 1954.